Hello, beta. Good afternoon, everyone. Today, first of all, we are going to go ahead and take question number 1D of 2022 IAS Economics Optional Paper 1. Right? बेटा क्वेश्चन देखते हैं. Discuss the factor endowment theory of trade in terms of abundance in factor prices and factor abundance. This is the question which has been asked to us, right? Okay, now let us try to go ahead and let us try to answer this. So we want to explain the factor endowment theory. सबसे पहला बेटा, the moment you read this question, it should hit your mind where exactly, right? You have gone ahead and you have studied द फैक्टर एंडोमेंट थ्योरी. पहला चीज यही होगा कि आप एक माइंड बनाओ कि फैक्टर एंडोमेंट थ्योरी हमने कौन से चैप्टर में इंटरनेशनल इकोनॉमिक्स में पढ़ी है, राइट? सो वी हैव स्टडीड द फैक्टर एंडोमेंट थ्योरी इन हेक्सेरोलिन मॉडल, right? So therefore we will go ahead and we will answer that this is a hexirollin model theory. But what does it say? It says that, any country which is abundant in any factor, right? So for example, let's say that there are two countries, India and US. Okay, and let's say India is labor abundant and US is capital abundant. Okay, in any country which is abundant in a particular factor will be exporting those goods which use that factor, right? And since you will be, since you will be supplying that product, right, not only to your own country, but to the rest of the world, right? Why is that happening? Why are you factor abundant in that good? You are factor abundant because you have that good at a relatively lower price. लेबर अगर चीप होगा तो ही तो आप फैक्टर अबंडेंट होगे. अगर लेबर चीप नहीं होगा आपकी कंट्री में तो आप लेबर अबंडेंट नहीं हो सकते हो, राइट? सो देयरफॉर वी अंडरस्टैंड दैट व्हेन वी टॉक अबाउट अबंडेंस, दो चीजें आती हैं. पहला फिजिकल अबंडेंस, कि लेबर की सप्लाई कैपिटल की सप्लाई से ज्यादा है, राइट? दैट इज इन द फैक्टर अबंडेंस, राइट? फैक्टर एंडोमेंट का अबंडेंस. एंड सेकेंड इज फैक्टर प्राइस अबंडेंस. फैक्टर प्राइस अबंडेंस ये बोलता है कि लेबर तब अबंडेंट होगा, लेबर तब ज्यादा होगा एज कंपेयर टू कैपिटल if we notice that the price of labor is relatively lower than the price of capital. So we want to answer two things in this beta. Question को ध्यान से देखो. One, we want to answer abundance in factor prices. माने factor prices की direction के through आप abundance को reach कर रहे हो. And second, we want to answer factor abundance. माने you are able to reach abundance because there is more of that factor as compared to the other factor. बात समझ में आती है? This is what this question is going ahead and asking. ये इस question का implication है, right? Now let us go ahead and let us try to answer this question. ठीक है. So as I told you कि not every time you will spend one line saying कि I know that this was given by Heckscher, ऐसे नहीं. You can just in the question itself mention that in the Heckscher model factor abundance refers to the following. ठीक है, इसी तरीके से आप बता पाओगे कि कि ये जो फैक्टर अबंडेंस वाला थ्योरी है ये हेक्सेरोलिन मॉडल के थ्रू आती है. You will be able to explain that through that. समझ रहे हो? So don't waste always a line on telling who gave what. वो मत करना. हाँ? Okay. Let us go ahead and let us begin the answer, beta. Write it with me. The factor abundance theory under Hegscher Allen model explains trade through differences in factor endowment between nations. It suggests country export goods that use its abundant factor intensively and imports goods that use scarce factor. तो जो फैक्टर अबंडेंट होगा आप उसका प्रोडक्शन ज्यादा करोगे. इफ यू विल प्रोड्यूस मोर ऑफ दैट गुड यू विल बी एबल टू मीट द अदर कंट्रीज डिमांड ऑल्सो. माने यू विल बी एबल टू एक्सपोर्ट दैट गुड and that factor which is scarce you will go ahead and you will import that good, right? So for example, India being labor intensive exports. Now you know that India is labor intensive, right? I mean India has abundance of labor. So since India has abundance of labor it can only export labor intensive good. और labor intensive good क्या होंगे? Cloth, textile sector, garments, IT services, right? Export textile, garments, IT services, which are labor intensive goods, which are labor intensive goods. क्लियर हो गई बात बेटा? तो ये हमारा पहला पॉइंट हो गया जिसमें हमने फैक्टर अबंडेंस थ्योरी को एक्सप्लेन किया है. Now just notice 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. बेटा important है. I know all of you know the concept. I am not explaining concept here. हाँ हमें ये भी समझना है कि कितने वर्ड्स में ये आंसर आ पा रहा है. 5 words. हाँ so on an average if I take 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, 45. तो माने we have covered till now 45 words, 45 to 50 words, 100 words are still left. तो now we have explained कि factor abundance theory होती क्या है. अब हम समझाएंगे कि what are the two things on which this factor abundant theory it it depends, right? So there are two criterias. Of this. One, factor price test. Right? This is, so factor price test says that a factor is relatively abundant if it is cheap, right? It's also called factor price test, your factor price approach, your relative price approach, all mean the same thing. So country is factor abundant if the relative price of that factor is lower compared to the other country, right? Compared to the other country. So consider country X and Y, right? And factor L and K, labor and capital, okay? If PK by PL in country X is less than PK by PL in country Y, so price of capital by labor is less in country X as compared to price of capital by labor in country Y. It means X has relatively cheap labor and should consider or should export, sorry, relatively cheap capital. Relatively cheap capital. PK by PL is less than PK by PL in Y. Relatively cheap capital and should export capital intensive goods. It should import capital intensive good. Okay. Irrespective of the K by L ratio in the two countries. So what this is going ahead and saying is that it does not matter to us what is the amount of capital and amount of labor in the two countries. What matters to us is that what is the price of capital and price of labor in the two countries, right? And if we have price of capital by labor less in country X as compared to country Y, then we can go ahead and we can say that country X, since capital is cheap, should be exporting capital. That's it. Capital intensive good. Bas. Okay. Now, second one. But this is the factor proportion or factor endowment test physically. Physical factor. So factor proportion or factor endowment test, we are talking about the actual amount of factor physically. Right. Now we will be considering the K by L ratio. Right. So country is factor abundant if it possesses large relative supply of factor as compared to another country. Right? For example, now we will be considering the actual K by L ratio. So we can go ahead and say if K by L in country X is less than K by L in country Y, Y has relatively more capital and should export capital intensive goods, should export capital intensive goods. ठीक. अच्छा, let me give you an example, बहुत important है बेटा. कंट्री X and Y, कैपिटल है 100, लेबर है 50, कैपिटल है 150, लेबर है 100. अब अगर आप देखो तो एब्सोल्यूट टर्म्स में लेबर और कैपिटल दोनों ही कंट्री वाई के पास ज्यादा है. तो इससे तो आपको लगेगा कि कंट्री वाई हैज बोथ लेबर एंड कैपिटल मोर, बट हम रिलेटिव निकालते हैं. तो यहाँ पे 100/50 आता है 2, एंड यहाँ पे 150/100 आता है 1.5. So K by L in country X is more than K by L in country Y here, right? So relatively, now X is more capital abundant. So X will produce and export capital intensive goods. X will produce and export capital intensive good. ये बात समझ में आती है? Is it clear बेटा? ठीक है. अच्छा, now the question had only asked this much. ठीक है. So I have answered factor endowment theory. The next part of factor endowment theory is actually factor equalization theorem. But because this is just a 10 marks question, because मुझे सिर्फ इतना समझाना था कि factor abundant theory होती क्या है. So I have answered that much well in this question and nothing else is required. ठीक है. If the word limit still remains, अगर आपको लगता है कि even after answering all of this, ma'am, I still have about 10, 15, 20 words left. I can write. तो आप criticism भी mention कर सकते हो. You can say that it ignores technology, transportation cost, assumes identical production functions, but otherwise speaking, this much answer is enough. ठीक है. ये एक sufficient, well sufficed answer है जिसमें हमने example भी दे दिया, हमने सब बता भी दिया. यहाँ पे इसको probably you can write it in words कि although Y has more of both inputs in the absolute terms, Y has more of both inputs in absolute terms, still you can go ahead and say कि we are considering the relative terms. ठीक है. Still X produces and exports capital intensive good. You can mention that. But just keep in mind कि word limit should not be crossed. Okay, is it clear? Any doubt? ठीक है बेटा. So this is how you can write the answer to question number 1D. Okay, thank you.